My husband filed for divorce on the morning of my 71st birthday. He had already moved our $3.2 million mountain home into a private trust before I opened the envelope. "You'll never lay eyes on those grandchildren again," he said quietly, so only I could hear. I left, but 9 months later, a number I didn't recognize lit up my phone. "Ma'am, this is Asheville Regional Medical. Your husband passed this morning." Good day, dear listeners. It's Lily. I'm so glad you're here with me today. Please like this video and stay until the end, and leave me a comment letting me know which city you're listening from. It means more to me than you know to see how far these words travel. I was not a woman who expected her life to come apart at 71. I had no reason to expect it. My husband and I had been married for 44 years. We had raised 2 children in the same house in the mountains outside Asheville, North Carolina. A stone and timber home on a ridge called Millbrook that my husband had designed himself in the early years of his career as a financial planner. We had a covered porch along the full length of the back of the house, facing the Blue Ridge. On clear October mornings, the view from that porch was something you could not adequately describe to someone who hadn't stood there. My name is Selma. I spent 31 years as the head librarian at an elementary school in Buncombe County. I knew every child in that building by name and by what they liked to read. My husband was Edgar. He was 73, recently retired, a man who had spent 4 decades managing other people's wealth and who was, by everything I had ever observed, careful and considered and steady. We had 2 children. Our son, Jerome, lived in Charlotte with his wife and their 2 daughters. Our daughter, Carla, was in Richmond, Virginia, with her husband and their little boy, 5 grandchildren between them. Every Christmas, the Millbrook house smelled like wood smoke and cinnamon and the beeswax candles my mother-in-law had made and I had kept making after she was gone. That was the life I believed in. That was the life I thought was permanent. The first thing I noticed was the way he angled his phone away from me. Edgar had never been a secretive man. He was the kind of man who left his wallet on the kitchen counter and his calendar open on the desk. So when he began sitting at the breakfast table with the screen turned toward the window, it was small. But it lodged somewhere I couldn't shake it. Then came the canceled dinners. We had gone to the same restaurant in downtown Asheville every Thursday for 11 years. The owner knew our order. In February, Edgar began replacing those evenings with explanations about meetings with former colleagues. He was retired. Former colleagues don't require that many meetings. In March, I found a receipt in the pocket of a sport coat I was taking to the dry cleaner. A restaurant in Greenville, South Carolina. A Tuesday evening. He had told me that Tuesday he was in Raleigh for a consultation with an old client. Raleigh is in the opposite direction from Greenville by nearly 4 hours. I said nothing immediately. I am not a woman who speaks before she understands what she's dealing with. I watched. I took note of dates. I made small, careful records of things that didn't add up. And by April, I knew. Her name was Jana Merritt. She was 49 years old, 24 years younger than Edgar, a financial planner who had been one of his clients in the early years of his practice and had since built her own firm in Greenville. I found her name through a search after I found her business card in his desk drawer, tucked beneath a stapler. That is not where you put the card of someone you see only professionally. I chose to raise it on a Saturday morning. The house was quiet, the coffee was fresh, there was nowhere easy for him to go. I set a cup in front of him and said his name and told him I knew. I told him I had known for some time. I asked him to tell me the truth. He didn't deny it. He set down his cup very carefully, looked at me across the table we had shared for 44 years, and said, "Selmas, I've spoken with an attorney. I'll be filing on Monday." That was all. No apology. No explanation of how or when or why it had come to this, filing on Monday, as if the prior 4 decades were a contract that had simply run its term. What followed was a legal process I was wholly unprepared for. Edgar had retained 2 attorneys from a firm in Asheville that specialized in complex asset litigation. I learned later he had been preparing for 14 months before he filed. Our primary home, The Millbrook house, appraised at $2.8 million, had been transferred into something called the Ashbridge Family Trust 16 months before the filing date. A joint investment account had been systematically drained through a series of transfers I could not immediately trace, leaving our shared holdings at roughly a quarter of what I remembered them being. I hired an attorney. He was a decent man who had spent 30 years handling estate documents and small property disagreements. He reviewed Edgar's filings and told me they appeared to be in order. He negotiated a settlement that left me with $280,000 after fees, no property, no income. I was 71 years old. In the courtroom on the day the settlement was finalized, Edgar sat with his attorneys and looked at the middle distance with the composure of a man who had already moved on. He passed me in the corridor afterward and said it without turning his head. "Jerome has already spoken to the grandchildren. You won't be at Christmas this year." He said it the way you'd mention the weather. I walked to my car. I sat in the parking garage for 20 minutes without starting the engine. Then I drove to Knoxville, Tennessee, where my oldest friend Myrtle had lived for the past 12 years since her own husband had died. Myrtle was 74. She was small and sharp-minded, and had a front porch she sat on in all weather, and a house full of plants she talked to as though they could hear her, which I came to believe they probably could. She opened her door before I finished knocking. She took one look at me and said, "Come inside. I'll put the kettle on." I stayed 4 weeks. I slept badly and ate slowly and let Myrtle's schedule become my own. Coffee at 6, a walk around the neighborhood at 7:30, lunch at noon, the evening news together. I made lists. That was always how I worked through difficulty. On a yellow legal pad from Myrtle's kitchen drawer, I wrote down everything I had lost. The house first, the Millbrook porch, the October light on the Blue Ridge, then the money, then my children's names. Jerome had called once after the settlement. He said his father had explained the situation and he hoped I would give Edgar space to move forward. The phrase "move forward" was said as if we were discussing a minor disagreement rather than the dismantling of a 44-year marriage through what I was beginning to understand was deliberate financial fraud. Carla had sent a text. One text. It said she was keeping out of it. I had driven Carla to the emergency room 3 times during her childhood. I had sat with Jerome through a frightening year when his business nearly failed. I had loved them without condition. They were keeping out of it. I wrote their names down, not from bitterness, not yet, but because writing things down was how I acknowledged what was real. In the 3rd week, sitting at Myrtle's kitchen table with a cup of tea gone cold, something shifted. I had been so fixed on what had happened to me that I hadn't stopped to ask a different question. Was what happened to me legal? I was not an attorney. I had spent my career surrounded by books, not courtrooms, but I had also spent 31 years managing a school library's budget, reading contracts with precision, because the children in my building depended on me getting those contracts right. I understood documents, and the more I examined the timeline, the trust formation 16 months before filing, the account transfers, the 14 months of preparation, the more I thought. My attorney never looked closely enough. I called him from Myrtle's kitchen. He was polite. He confirmed he had reviewed Edgar's filings as submitted. I asked him one question. Had he independently verified when Edgar made the decision to divorce, or had he simply accepted the trust formation date at face value? Because if the trust had been formed after Edgar decided to end the marriage but before he filed, if the intent to defraud preceded the filing, that could constitute fraudulent transfer of marital property under North Carolina law. A pause on the line. Then he said, "Mrs. Selma, that's quite a specific question." I said, "I know. Can you answer it?" He could not. He had not looked. I spent 2 days researching attorneys who specialized in high-asset divorce fraud and post-judgment motions. I found a firm in Raleigh called Crescent Law Group, known for complex financial misconduct litigation. I found that North Carolina law permitted post-judgment motions when fraud could be demonstrated in the original proceedings. I found that asset transfers into private trusts within 2 years of a divorce filing could be scrutinized for fraudulent intent. I wrote all of this down in my careful, even handwriting. Then I called and made an appointment. The attorney who met with me was named Linnea. She was in her mid-40s, with a quality of stillness I recognized immediately in people who spend their days in rooms where a great deal depends on staying calm. She did not raise her voice or soften her vocabulary for my benefit. She asked me to begin at the beginning. I talked for nearly 2 hours. She took notes and asked precise questions, exact dates, entity names, dollar amounts. When I finished, she set her pen down. "The trust formation date," she said. "Do you have the registration documents?" Before I left Asheville, while I still had access to Edgar's files, I had photographed every document I could find. I handed her the printed copies. She studied them. If this trust was formed after Edgar had already decided to divorce you, and there are ways to establish that decision chronologically, you have grounds for a fraud claim that could reopen the settlement entirely. I retained Linnea that afternoon. The retainer cost me $3,500, and I paid it without hesitation. Some expenditures are not expenses. They are necessary turns in the road. Linnea filed the post-judgment motion within 10 days, citing fraudulent conveyance and requesting full discovery of Edgar's financial records for the prior 30 months. The motion was accepted. Discovery notices were served. I know the precise moment Edgar learned about it because Jerome called me. The first time he had reached out since that single conversation after the settlement. His voice had that familiar tightness from adolescence. "Mom, Dad says you've hired new attorneys. He says you're trying to undo the settlement. I've filed a post-judgment motion. That's accurate. This is only going to drag everything out and cost you money you don't have." "Jerome," I said, "did your father ask you to make this call?" The silence that followed was its own answer. "Tell him I said hello," I said, and I ended the call. The discovery materials arrived 8 weeks later in a thick envelope from Linnea's office. The Ashbridge Family Trust had been registered in Delaware on February 19th. Edgar had filed for divorce 14 months later, on April 11th. That gap looked like advance planning on its face, but it was what the subpoenaed communications revealed that mattered. Among Edgar's text messages, recovered under court order, was a thread with Jonna Merritt from the previous December, 15 months before he filed for divorce. "Edgar, I want the Millbrook house protected before any of this becomes official. Can the trust handle that cleanly?" Jonna: "Yes. Once the title transfers in, it's outside the marital estate. Smart to move now." Edgar: "How long does the transfer take?" Jana: 6 to 8 weeks with Delaware registration. I can walk you through the whole thing." I read those messages sitting in Linnea's office on a gray Tuesday morning. I read them twice. I set the papers down. "Is this enough?" I asked. She allowed herself a small, controlled smile. "He asked explicitly about protecting the asset before the divorce became official. That's documented intent. That's exactly what we needed." Linnea filed the formal motion to vacate the settlement within the week, attaching the texts as Exhibit A. She also filed for a temporary injunction preventing any sale or transfer of the Ashbridge Family Trust assets while the motion was pending. The injunction was granted in 60 hours. Then the children came. Carla arrived first without calling ahead. She had driven from Richmond, 4 hours, which told me the trip had been planned with some urgency. She sat at Myrtle's kitchen table with her hands folded and said she was worried about both of us. About the toll of extended litigation, about what it was doing to the family. "Did you see the texts?" I asked. She paused. "Dad says they're being taken out of context." "Then his attorneys can explain that to the judge." She stayed 2 hours. She cycled through the same concerns repeatedly. Edgar's age, the cost of litigation, the stress on the grandchildren. When she left, she hugged me in the doorway with the stiffness of obligation. I watched her car turn out of Myrtle's Street and felt a sadness that was distinct from anger. My daughter had driven 4 hours not to support me, but to manage me. I understood that. I did not accept it. Jerome's approach was harder. He called rather than visited and told me that if I continued the legal action, the relationship could not be maintained in its current form. He said the grandchildren had been told that Grandma was doing something that was hurting the family, and then he said Jana's name. Deliberately, she had already been introduced. She was already present in their lives. Jerome, I said, I hope you've been thoughtful about what you've told those girls. Because if this reaches a full hearing, the court will want to understand how your father communicated with his family during these proceedings. A long silence. I'm not threatening you, I said. I'm informing you. There's a difference. He didn't call again for several months. The hearing was set for October. Linnea and I had spent the intervening months building the case with a thoroughness that turned anxiety into something more functional. A structure, a sequence, a set of facts that held together under pressure. Beyond the texts, discovery had produced the full account transfer records, Jana's professional correspondence advising on the trust strategy, and an analysis from a forensic accountant of Edgar's financial activity over the 30 months preceding the divorce filing. The picture it assembled was not ambiguous. It was a systematic, deliberate effort to remove the primary marital asset from the estate before filing, undertaken with the active participation of a woman who stood to benefit directly from the outcome. The courthouse in Raleigh was modern and quiet. I wore my good wool coat, slate gray, bought years ago for a faculty dinner, because I believe in arriving at serious occasions as seriously as they deserve. Edgar arrived with 2 attorneys. He looked thinner than he had in the spring. He sat at his table, and for the first 20 minutes did not look at me once. Linnea presented the evidence methodically, the timeline, the texts, the forensic analysis, the trust formation documents. Each exhibit entered cleanly, each connection made precisely. Edgar's lead attorney, a man named Dunmore, argued that the Ashbridge Trust had been formed for legitimate estate planning, that the texts had been taken out of context, that Jana Merritt had provided standard professional guidance, that no fraudulent intent could be demonstrated. The judge, the Honorable Bertina Wallace, who was in her early 60s and had the unhurried attentiveness of someone who had seen every variety of evasion, asked Dunmore one question. If the intent was estate planning unrelated to the marriage, why does Mr. Fenwick's message to Ms. Merritt specifically reference ensuring the house is protected before any of this becomes official? What does this refer to? Dunmore began to answer. He was halfway through his second sentence when Edgar turned from his chair and said, loudly enough for the full courtroom to hear, because it was my money. I built that life. I had every right to decide what happened to it. The room went still. Judge Wallace looked at Edgar directly. Mr. Fenwick, she said, your attorney is addressing the court. A beat. Please allow him to continue. Dunmore touched Edgar's arm. Edgar sat back. But the moment had already happened. The judge had heard it. The court reporter had recorded it. The words were in the room. Dunmore continued, but the rhythm of his argument had broken. He stumbled twice in the following minutes, misstated an exhibit number, caught himself. Edgar sat beside him with his jaw set and his hands flat on the table, and I could see from 30 feet away that he understood, perhaps for the first time, that the outcome was no longer certain. I did not look away. The written ruling came 26 days later. I was at Myrtle's kitchen table with a cup of coffee when Linnea called at 9 in the morning. She read it to me in order. The court found by clear and convincing evidence that Edgar had engaged in fraudulent conveyance of marital property with the intent to deprive me of my equitable share of the marital estate. The Ashbridge Family Trust had been formed in bad faith with full knowledge of its effect on the divorce proceedings. The January texts were cited extensively throughout the opinion. Jana Merritt was named as a knowing participant in the scheme and ordered to provide a complete accounting of the professional services she had rendered to Edgar during the relevant period. The original settlement was vacated. Under North Carolina's equitable distribution standards, accounting for the deliberate disadvantage I had been placed under, I was awarded 60% of the reconstructed marital estate. The total figure, including the Millbrook house, or its cash equivalent, came to approximately $2.1 million. I sat at Myrtle's kitchen table with the phone at my ear and looked out the window at the persimmon tree she had planted in her backyard the year her husband died. October light came through it in long, quiet angles. "Selma," Linnea said, "did you hear all of that?" "Yes," I said, "every word." I thanked her. I told her she had been extraordinary. She said the evidence had been extraordinary, and that my own preparation had made her work considerably easier. We agreed to speak the following day about implementation. I set the phone down. Myrtle was in the doorway. She had heard enough from my side of the call to understand. She crossed the kitchen, and we held each other the way old friends do, not elegantly, just completely. When we sat back down, she put her hand over mine and left it there, and we watched the light move through the window for a long time without saying anything at all. There was nothing needed saying that the silence couldn't hold better. On the fourth day after the ruling, a number I didn't recognize lit up my phone. An 828 area code, Western North Carolina, I answered. The man identified himself as a physician at Asheville Regional Medical Center. He spoke carefully, in the measured language hospitals train doctors to use for difficult news. Edgar had been found at the Millbrook house by a neighbor who noticed the lights hadn't changed in 2 days. He had suffered a cardiac event. He had been alone. He had been transported, but there was nothing to be done by the time he arrived. He was 73 years old. Jana Merritt had been unreachable. Jerome told the hospital she had left for a trip to Hilton Head the week before. I stood in Myrtle's hallway after the call and was very still for a long time. "What do you feel when the man who wronged you dies?" I have thought about that question many times since. The answer is not simple, and I'm not going to make it simple. I felt grief. Real, complicated grief for the man he had been before he became who he was at the end. The one who designed the Millbrook house with a south-facing porch because he knew I loved morning light. The one who drove 3 hours without being asked when my mother was dying. I felt the particular hollowness of anger when it no longer has an object, and underneath both of those things, I felt a sober recognition. The ruling stood. His death did not erase the judgment. His estate was legally obligated to honor the court's order. I attended the graveside service briefly, at a distance, because 44 years requires some acknowledgement, and I am not a woman who refuses what's real. I stood at the edge and said goodbye to the man I had married, who was not the same man who had died, and then I got in my car and drove. The estate proceedings took 11 months. The Millbrook house sold the following spring for $2.9 million. My court-ordered share was transferred to my account in full. As for Jana Merritt, the court ordered her to return the fees Edgar had paid her during the period in question, plus damages totaling just over $300,000 for her role in the fraudulent transfer. She contested it. She lost. The North Carolina Financial Planning Licensing Board opened a separate review. I was told her practice had lost several significant clients after the case became known in professional circles. She had expected, from what Jerome eventually told me, to benefit substantially from Edgar's estate once everything was settled. She received nothing. Edgar's will named her, but the court judgment was a senior claim. By the time legal fees and estate costs were settled, the remaining estate was modest. Jana's attorneys challenged the accounting. She lost that too. I did not feel satisfaction exactly when I heard this. What I felt was more neutral, the recognition that choices, over time, tend to produce outcomes that reflect them. Not always, not reliably, but sometimes, and this was one of those times. My daughter Carla called 2 months after the ruling. She did not have a specific apology. She hadn't done anything specific enough to apologize for. She had simply been absent when I needed her. We talked for an hour carefully, a little stiffly. It was a beginning. Jerome took longer, but he called eventually. in the way people do when the version of events they were handed turns out to have been incomplete. I moved to Savannah, Georgia. I had driven through it once, years before, and remembered the quality of the light, the way it came through Spanish moss in the old squares, softer than mountain light, more patient. I rented an apartment near the river while I figured out what I actually wanted. I found a small house with a walled garden and a side porch where the evenings were long. I planted things. I joined a church with a choir that sang old hymns on Sunday mornings. I found the branch library nearest to my neighborhood and became a volunteer reader for their children's program, which felt, in a way I cannot fully explain, like returning to something essential in myself. I made a friend, a retired pediatric nurse originally from Alabama, with a laugh that arrived like weather, sudden and completely genuine and contagious. We walked together 4 mornings a week along the river and argued about whatever we were reading with the cheerful stubbornness of people who take books seriously. It was ordinary. It was sustaining. It was enough. More than enough. Here is what I know now that I did not know at 71. Age is not the same thing as diminishment. Grief is not the end of clear thinking, and the people who count on your silence, who build their plans on the assumption that you are too tired, too old, too worn down to look carefully at what has been done, are almost always undone by the moment you decide to look. I was not a remarkable woman before any of this happened. I was a librarian who loved morning light and her grandchildren and a good cup of coffee on a covered porch. I am still that woman. I simply decided, when it mattered most, to pay attention to the documents. What would you have done in my place? Would you have taken the $280,000 and called it enough? I have wondered. I don't judge the answer. Exhaustion is real, and life is long, and sometimes you take the settlement because you simply cannot carry one more thing. But if you are listening to this and something in your own life does not add up, if the numbers don't match what you remember, if the story you have been given has gaps that don't close, trust that feeling. Ask the question. Look closely. You are not too old to look. If this story stayed with you, leave me a comment. Tell me which city you're listening from. Subscribe if you'd like to hear more. And thank you, truly, for being here with me today.